Today we have with us Professor Vinod Kumar Jha. He is head of PG Department of English at SKM University, Dumka, Jharkhand. His thirst areas of interest in academics are linguistics, translation, and of course teaching of English as a second language. He worked as a resource person at Academic Staff College, Ranchi. He has translated a book of Hindi short stories in English titled The Speeches and Other Stories. And another translation he has published, that is Let's Kill Gandhi. So other than that, he has other publications also. So Professor Vinod has been in his service for over 38 years in teaching, contributed a lot to the nation by publishing good number of books, chapters, and research articles. He delivered academic lectures and taught courses in many universities and institutions in India and abroad as well. His association with NTM continues from the previous training batches. So we are very happy to, introduce Professor Vinod Kumar Jha to you. Now he will talk on managing loss and gain in literary translation. Sir, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello and good afternoon to all of you. My greetings to all of you who are on this program now today. The topic that I'll be talking on is managing loss and gain in literary translation. I'll be talking about the theoretical foundations of this concept, and I'll be illustrating with examples from books, translated books in Hindi and English both. I have translated books from and into Hindi and English. I have translated as Madam and then the introducer said that I have translated a book, The Speechless and Other Stories. It is a book of short stories. I translated 24 stories from Hindi into English, and 21 of them have been published in this book form. I have also translated a book, two sections of the book. The book is a well-known book, Let's Kill Gandhi by Tushar Gandhi. Two parts of the book are already published, and the third part is in the process of being published. Today, the topic that I'm going to talk on concerns the central issue of translation in general and literary translation in particular. Loss and gain. Translation occurs when a message or text produced in one language, the source language, is converted into a message in another language, the receptor or target language. Given the fact that no two languages are identical, it stands to reason that there can be no absolute correspondence between languages, which constitutes a difficulty for the translator, who strives to render the meanings conceived in source language text as closely as possible in the target language text. These differences between two languages, the differences between two languages exist at various levels, including grammatical, semantic, and sociocultural. According to Nida, one of the founders of modern translation studies, all types of translation theories, a translation involve loss of information, addition or information, and or third, skewing of information. As a matter of fact, perfect equivalence between two languages is practically impossible. And each act of transferring between different languages engenders necessarily some loss and gain. The notion of loss in translation was defined by Nojizwe and Nkube as the disappearance of certain features in the translated text which are present in the source language text. That is to say, that the discrepancies between the two linguistic systems cause some elements of source language text, such as its characteristics and information contained within, to vanish during the process of transferring to the target text. Gain is a notion that relates to a situation where the gain features are not present in the source text. Gain is a concept that focuses on the enrichment or clarification of the source language text. Bassnett defined gain as the enrichment or clarification of the source language text in the process of translation. The same concept is proposed by Nojizwe and Nkube, that gain in the translation, on the one hand, refers to the enrichment or clarification of the source text, which enables language and the target text to be flexible and usable in any social circle. Gain in translation will help languages to adapt themselves to their speakers. Salis noted that the gain could only be a matter of expressing the meaning to a greater degree in the translation as compared with the original. Maguire alludes to this concept that language can gain through explanation. He says the translator can at times enrich or clarify the source language text as a direct result of the translation process. Moreover, what is often seen as lost from the source language can be replaced in the target language context. Rojizwe and Nkube confirm that gain revolves around the enrichment of the target language. Loss can occur at different levels: phonological loss, morphological loss, grammatical loss, semantic loss, cultural loss. The aspects of gain in the target language, target text. As Maguire has been mentioned earlier, what is often seen as lost in the source language context may be replaced in the target language context. The following samples present in the gained features in the target language. Compensation in kind consists in making up one type of textual effect in the source language by another type in the target text. It is one of the techniques that can be adopted to mitigate the loss of source language features. Another strategy that translators adopt is the strategy of addition. Addition is one of the techniques suggested by Mona Baker to deal with the non-equivalence, which consists of adding anything that is needed, such as a word, a clause, in order to make the translated text appear natural, either grammatically or semantically. Or a loan word can also be used to mitigate the loss from the source language text to the target language text. The difficulty of finding an adequate equivalent in target may be managed by using a loan word. There are certain related terms also, like gaps in literary translation, especially gaps in all types of translation, especially in literary translation. There is another related term, untranslatability. Untranslatability. It is a tongue twister word. As I said earlier, languages differ. No two languages are identical. Translation is a movement from one language to another, from source language to the target language. The two languages will differ in their sound systems, their grammatical systems, semantic systems, in vocabulary, and so on. Languages are classified on typological basis. Languages are classified on genealogical basis. On genealogical basis, languages are said to belong to families. Like there are language families, like Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, Malayalam belong to the Dravidian family of languages, one of the world's primary family of languages. Hindi, Urdu, Odia, Bangla belong to the largest language family of the world. Languages are also these languages are also classified on the basis of their structural characteristics. They can be classified on the basis of morphology, on the basis of syntax. On the basis of morphology, languages can be classified as inflecting or synthetic or agglutinative. On the basis of syntactic structure, languages are classified as SOV, SVO, and so on. Languages are also classified on the basis of their phonological characteristics, on the basis of how their syllables combine, their phonemes combine, and on the basis of their suprasegmental features, and such as stress, pitch, and intonation. Thus, languages may be classified as stress timed, syllable timed. Moreover, language has a locus. It is spoken and reflects a specific setting and will vary from place to place, even within a comparative small distance. And the language evolves through a cultural setting. Culture shapes and changes a language, sometimes separating rather than uniting. So every language has developed a form which is uniquely suited or adapted to perform the functions of communication within a speech community. Because of these differences in languages, gaps occur in the process of translation. When source language has a concept that the target language lacks, gaps are also called lacunas, blank spaces, slippages, absences, and voids. Gaps are inevitable and occur across the types of translation. And every translator faces the challenge of bridging these gaps. But for a literary translator, the challenge is all the more exacting and demanding for the sheer quality of the language, of literature, for the sheer quality of the language in which literature is used. There are three types of gaps: linguistic gap, cultural gap, extra linguistic gap. Linguistic gap occurs because of the differences in structural characteristics. Gaps may occur at all the levels of language: graphological level, phonological level, lexical word level, and sentence level. Cultural gap. This gap will be discussed in some detail later. According to Newmark, culture includes foods, habits, dress, festivals, rituals, etc. Extra linguistic gap. Extra linguistic gap occurs prominently in drama translation because a drama is such a genre of literature in which is not like poetry and novel. It is not written for private reading. It is written for a stage. It is originally written for a stage. So there are many features like the body language of the characters, many other features which are extra linguistic features. So in drama translation, this gap occurs. Cultural terms can be grouped into following categories: ecology, material culture, social culture, organization, customs, activities, techniques and concepts, gestures and habits. The following techniques may be used in translation of cultural terms: literal translation, transference, borrowing, substitution, paraphrasing, addition, deletion, blending. How a literary translator manages the process of gain and loss will be explained now. The language that literature uses is not only denotative, but connotative and figurative also. A literary artist is a gifted person who can use all the resources of a language and culture to create a work of art and achieve an aesthetic excellence to delight humanity across ages, across cultures. A literary artist is endowed with what Coleridge calls secondary imagination. In Lionel Trilling, his words, a literary artist can articulate the buzz of times, which all of you feel but cannot express. Now, so not everyone can be a Subramanyam Bharati uh, or Ezu Thatchen or a Jaishankar Prasad or a Premchand or an Eliot or Maya Angelou or a Shakespeare. The problem of a literary translator is compounded by the fact that literature has genres, mainly poetry, drama, and novel, and each genre has its own special features. I'll now discuss in brief what are the problems of literary translator, what a literary translator faces because of the particular characteristics of these genres, and how they can manage the gaps or the phenomenon of loss and gain. First, of course, poetry, the queen of the arts. Poetry, as I said, is the queen of the arts. There is a character in a film, A Dead Poets Society, John Keating, and I quote his statement from the film. He says, "We don't read and write poetry because we don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of human race." This is an echo from Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold, the great critic, poet of the 19th century. The lines that he wrote in his preface to the study of poetry establish poetry at the highest, at the highest rank, higher than culture, religion. And I always, whenever I talk about poetry, I refer to Matthew Arnold's words about poetry. He says, more and more mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. Further, he says, currency and supremacy are ensured to it, not indeed by the world's deliberate and conscious choice, but by something far deeper, by the instinct of self-preservation in humanity. There is not, and there are other, I think, he talks about the highest kind of poetry, the best kind of poetry, and all that. But what I mean to say that poetry has a quality that makes it very difficult for a translator to translate from one language into another. As uh, Frost said, one of the greatest American poets of our times, that poetry is what is lost in translation. One cannot translate poetry, but poetry has been translated. We have been reading poetry, benefiting from the message that poetry gives us to poetry translation is difficult. It is difficult, perhaps partly because poetry itself is difficult, as I said now. It could indeed be argued that it is poetry's resistance to facile communication that makes it so difficult. An important area of current debate in translation studies is concerned with how our understanding of poetry impacts our understanding of its translation. Both prose and poetry, for example, have rhythm, but only poetry has meter, the regular grouping of elements of rhythm into a recognizable pattern. What counts as meter or what counts as poetry will, of course, differ according to the particular cultural and historical context, as will any definition of translation. You know, rhythm, to retain a rhythm in translation or not to retain a rhythm in translation is a very crucial question for a literary translation. If you retain a rhythm, it may result in padding that I'll explain later in my lecture, or it can result in skewed kind of meaning if you retain rhythm. If you do not retain rhythm, you lose a very essential quality in a poem. Because poetry is akin to music. Poetry, in poetry, a poet uses sounds particular to a language system to support his meaning. If you remember a poem, for example, I sometimes remember that poem by Tennyson, Break, Break, Break. That is a that is a small, short poem, but if you read that poem, you will know how a poet uses sounds to express a kind of mental state. There are poems and poems in Hindi, English, and Tamil which you can read to understand this concept of how a poetry is akin to music. For poetry, this is in addition to the issues of transfer of content, form, function, and so on that play a role in literary translation. The translation of the particular shape of poems is also a major factor. Thus, without an understanding of the notion of shape, repetition, and pattern, and how these are viewed in both source and target cultures, that is, without an understanding of poetic style, poetry translation cannot possibly result in texts that are themselves poems. You can read it that poems cannot be translated. You can recreate a poem in another language. These are some of the problems that a translator faces in translating poetry. This ambiguity of poetry leads to different potential problems for translation. Most definitions of translation suggest that meaning is a large part of what translation transfers, and and most modern definitions of poetry suggest that open-endedness of its meaning, suggest that the open-endedness of its meaning, which allows different readers to interpret it differently, lies at the heart of poetry. How then can meaning, thus open to interpretation, to be transferred into a target text? These are some of the questions that a literary translator has to face. The translator needs to take into account that all such stylistic features of the text have psychological effects upon the reader. In particular, communicative views of translation argue that a large part of the purpose of literary translation is to communicate such effects to a new set of readers. When we come to the translation of drama, as I told you, Drama is a genre, literary genre, which is basically different, fundamentally different from poetry and novel. Poetry and novel, as I said earlier, are basically meant for private reading. Drama is originally written for stage, and that causes the particular problems in the translation of drama. In drama translation, a very prominent debate has been raging, stage versus stage, whether to translate the drama for reading or to translate it for the stage, for performability. Drama can be said to be the most complex and multidimensional in these genres. Why? Drama is a complex form, as I said, because it is not simply meant to be read like poetry or the novel, but is written for the production in the theater. We remember, if you remember Shakespeare's, if you have read Shakespeare, Shakespeare never cared to publish his dramas under his care. Uh, his dramas were published by in 1623, the authoritative of edition by the two actors of his Globe Theatre. And Shakespeare never cared to get his dramas published. He basically wrote his dramas for the stage. We all know this. Do we simply try to translate the written text, or do we try to translate the text keeping in mind its playability? These are the central questions. Can we separate these two aspects? It is these questions that make a translator's task so complex. It is multidimensional because it incorporates other literary genres such as poetry and forms of the fine arts like music. But when we talk about the inclusion of these forms, we are talking of drama in its complete form, from its script to the theater production. A story, poem, as I said earlier, a novel is written for a readership of the and the poet and novelist is free to give rein to his her imagination. If you compare a novel, for example, by Tolstoy and a drama by Shakespeare or Eliot in our time in the 20th century. If you have read Tolstoy, War and Peace, he begins his drama in a relaxed manner, not in a hurry. But a dramatist, if you read Shakespeare's Hamlet, for example, compare the two. Tolstoy is sometimes compared with Shakespeare. For 50 to 100, for 50 pages at least, in Tolstoy, he is introducing his characters, a whole army of characters, and you will have to turn back to the earlier pages to connect then any character with a prior introduction of the character. But Shakespeare, just remember Hamlet, such a concise, tightly woven drama. When he introduces his characters, how he introduces his characters, how he introduces the tone of his plays in the very first scene. He will not introduce his character in the very first scene. There were many theatrical reasons for it. So just compare the two books and you will find how a drama differs from a novel. In drama, the construction of the drama is tightly woven. I'll discuss it. A novelist, can take liberties, as I said, liberty in narrating and describing the background, the characters. Not, not a dramatist. Not a dramatist. He has to follow the time, unities of time, place. You already annexed and you already have read these things. A dramatist cannot afford the luxury of describing his characters. Translating drama really is a very difficult task. But a dramatist has to write for an audience and has to keep in mind the basic principles of stagecraft, the use of time and place, the creation of characters, use of dialogue, tone of voice, facial expressions, costumes, scenery, and so on. In short, dialogue is delivered in a particular time and place and highlights the situation or modifies it. It also reveals the dynamics of the relationships between characters. But dialogue itself derives its full significance within the total context of the play. Therefore, in a play, it is not just linguistic element that is important, but also the extra linguistic situation, as I mentioned earlier while discussing the gaps in literary translation. So there are other problems, whether it is a translation or transformation. Do we translate or transform a drama script? If we think minutely, we transform rather than translate. If you read translations of some modern dramas like Hasiram Kotwal, for example, there is a translation of Shakespeare's drama, The Merchant of That Merchant of Venice was translated by one of the greatest writers of Hindi literature, to say one of the pioneers of Hindi literature, Bhartendu Harishchandra, and he completely transformed The Merchant of Venice. Even the title, and I read out some of the names, and he changed the names of the characters. He changed the names of the characters, like Shylock. Shylock becomes Shailash in his translation, and it's a very interesting. One can think of this. He has translated The Merchant of Venice. The title in the
Sorry, sir, somebody started sharing. Krishna Priya, can you please stop sharing your screen? Who is this, Krishna Priya?
Should I continue? Let that someone who is presenting to everyone. Yes.
Please continue.
Yes. The names of the characters have also changed. Portia has become Purastri. Shylock has become Shailash. Antonio has become Vasa. So these are some of the problems that the translation of that literary translator faces in translation. And then, it is a case of complete domestication, foreignizing and domestication, the two terms that are the current in the process of translation. A complete transformation of the Merchant of Venice into the Indian context. So how a translator, a literary translator of a drama has to make choices. He has to make a choice whether to transform into complete the milieu and setting of the target text, or to retain the features of the source text. And then we come to the translation of fiction, novel, short stories. And the difficulties arise in the translation of fiction not only from vocabulary, but also from cultural artifacts found in the target culture. This aspect I discussed when I talk about my own experiences as a literary translator. The greater the cultural distance between the source culture and the target culture, the more the translator will need to bridge that gap. How much explanation does the target language reader need to make sense of the text? A great deal, not much, none at all. Any wide gap between the source language and the target language cultures will introduce the problem of whether to attempt to provide sufficient background to approximate the source language reader's response to that word or phrase. There are three basic ways to cope with lacuna in target language readers' knowledge of the source language culture: footnotes, interpolation, and omission. Some translators adopt this approach routinely, especially academicians who take up this profession of literary translation. They desire, based on their training in their disciplines, they desire to convey the maximum possible amount of information and thereby uphold scholarly standards of objectivity and comprehensiveness while affording the opportunity for others to verify their work. These are worthy goals, to be sure, but are they consistent with the ends of literature? In the absence of footnotes in the original, the translation that includes them is a warped reflection. Why? Because they destroy the mimetic effect. The attempt by most fiction writers to create the illusion that the reader is actually witnessing, if not experiencing, the events described. Footnotes break the flow, disturbing the continuity by drawing the eye, albeit briefly, away from the text to a piece of information that, however useful, is still a disruptor in the willing suspension of disbelief. Once again, to refer to Coleridge. There is another strategy that a literary translator adopts in the translation of fiction, that is interpolation. That is one strategy that is commonly found among the literary translators. And this is something that creates a kind of that does not prevent the reader from disrupting his flow of reading a target language text, not translated text. In its basic form, this interpolation is nothing more than adding a parenthetical word or phrase as undoubtedly as clearly as possible. Interpolations should always be short. Remember, you are not, a translator is not rewriting the book. Never more than few words. And there is another strategy that a literary translator adopts in trying to bridge the gap. Omission. Omission does not mean cutting out a portion of the work that presents difficulties. Deleting any part of the original text is the equivalent of unconditional surrender. It means that you are not able to translate something from the source language text to the target language text. Rather, what is omitted is the explanation, leaving the reader to his own devices. In the case of, particularly in the case of money references, this is probably the best alternative. You know, if you read a novel of some 100 years ago, there in the novel, a sum of 500 rupees would be a fortune, or 1,000 rupees would be an amount of 1,000 rupees, 5,000 rupees would be a fortune. If you translate that text now, how would you refer to that amount of money? Because 5,000 rupees in today's terms will be nothing. It will not be a fortune. So there is one problem. So a translator has to adopt certain strategies to bridge this gap. In the case of money references, this is probably the best alternative to leave out. Just let the amount remain and leave the reader to decide what he understands. Efforts to transfer monetary units in target language equivalents run into many-fold obstacles. And even if the translator appends a note such as about 500 rupees or 5,000 rupees, this leaves unresolved the problem of how much that sum represents in today's value. When dealing with translation of money, one technique, one of the two approaches that can be adopted, always with the to substitute a dollar amount that makes sense in the context, or the number can be mentioned without specifying the currency, like this. Now it is up to the translator to decide which of the three strategies he has to adopt. Footnote, interpolation, or omission? That is your call. Though there are no surveys on the subject, anecdotal evidence indicates that most translations prefer to avoid footnotes in fiction. In cases of absolute necessity, they may decide on endnotes or, better yet, a glossary at the conclusion of the book. By doing so, they leave the reader to decide whether to break the mimetic flow. In an ideal world, the reader would peruse the glossary before beginning the book. In such a world, of course, translators would be accorded equal footing with authors. Now, I'll discuss some examples of how this problem is tackled in translation from Hindi literature, translation in the case of Hindi literature into English, and vice versa. As far as the translation of native Indian literatures, and especially Hindi literature, into English is concerned, the translator faces three major issues. The first is grasping the meaning of the original text, which requires a deep understanding of its linguistic structure and idiom, subtle cultural nuances, and varied interpretations of the same word or phrase. For example, the same Hindi expression, aankh lagna. I hope all of you understand this. Aankh lagna can have widely different meanings when used in slightly different ways. किसी से आंख लगना denote, किसी की आंख लगना denotes sleep. किसी से आंख लगना, किसी it is falling in love. किसी पर आंख लगना denotes desire. Like this. The second issue is the transfer of the exact meaning of the original text. And the third issue involves communicating the meaning of the original text. Here, the translator has to adapt a reader-based approach with due reference for the structure and idiom of the target language, the place and time of his readers. For example, translation of Hindi months like Chaitra, Baishakh, Jait, and so on. For example, Chaitra ka mahina can be variously translated as the month of April or the end of the spring season or the month of April. Now, a question for you. I hope there are students among the audience, students of English literature. I hope all of you have read sonnet number 18 of William Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Summer here is something very pleasant, very beautiful. So much so for, a, for an Elijah Beaton, after the harsh winter, spring comes, the sun comes out, and then summer comes. Summer in this poem is so pleasant, so much so that it has qualified to be compared to the eyes of the beloved. Summer here in the Indian context, not to say much, so torturing sometimes. Summer, an Indian summer. How would you, if suppose you are asked to translate this poem into your native language, maybe Tamil, maybe Bangla, maybe Telugu, how will you translate this? How will you translate that meaning of summer in this poem? Summer, which is conceived as something very pleasant, very beautiful time. So, think about it. Due to climate change, even in England now, summer is not so pleasant that it could be, or it could have been, or it would have been in Shakespeare's time. You can translate this poem into your own language. Try to find an equivalent that can adequately capture the meaning and the emotion that the poem seeks to convey. English translations of native Indian literatures and vice versa, from from Indian literatures into English and from English into Indian literatures, have certain limitations. The translator must be sensitive uh, to the dissimilarity or differences in the nature of Indian languages and English. For instance, Hindi and English have different grammatical structures. The second obstacle is untranslatability of culture specific terms. It is not always possible to duplicate suggestive usages, peculiar words or styles, sentence structures, sociocultural idioms, ideologies, subtle nuances of meaning, situation specific expression. For example, Hindi word ah, Hindi words ah, tum, tu denote decreasing degrees of respect. But they have just one neutral English equivalent, you. In certain parts of India, if you do not use "are" and you use "you," there can be a very difficult situation, a very unpleasant situation, if you call someone "tum" in place of "are." Not in all parts of India. And then there are terms of for family relationships, like kaka, chacha, mama, tau, fufa, mosa. In English, all these words, they have only one word, uncle. Now I'll briefly discuss a book by way of illustrating how a translator manages his way through different languages and cultures, and bridges the gaps in literary translation. This book contains 20 stories. This is a book, Great Hindi Short Stories by Ravi Nandan Sinha. I'll discuss a few examples from this book. This book contains 20 stories, of the greatest Hindi writers, such as Premchand, Chandradhar Sharma Guleri, that Usne Kaha Tha fame, Sudarshan, Mamta Kalia, one of the contemporary writers, and many others. Faniswarnath Renu. The selection of the stories for this book is really commendable. the stories that the translator selected. They are really representative stories of these great writers. Two stories I have selected for my discussion to illustrate how a truly accomplished translator of the of a truly accomplished translator can achieve uh, or can bridge the gaps, the cultural gaps. These two stories are one, Usne Kaha Tha, and another story that I have selected is by Paniswarnath Renu, the wrestler's Pahalwan Ki Dholi. Usne Kaha Tha is one of the greatest love stories in Hindi literature. It is a story about a Sikh soldier, Lehna Singh, uh, who lays down his life, who dies to save the son and husband of his childhood beloved. It is a story of the First World War. It is the story of the martial spirit of the Indian Army, particularly the Sikh regiment. Guler is partially archaic language, which is a mixture of Hindi, Punjabi, and Urdu. His complex sentences and his leisurely style, sometimes ornate, sometimes colloquial, moving back and forth in time, alternating romantic scenes with pictures from the battlefield and from Amritsar, are not easy to translate. To preserve the cultural effect, Dr. Sinha retains most of the local usages and reserves their meanings for the glossary, with the exception of textually important words like kurvai, which is translated as engagement in the text itself. Then there are usages like the beloved spreading her anchor. This is a word that I'll discuss when I talk about my own experiences as a literature. Anchal, in the story, if you have read the story, that is a wonderful story. Lana Singh, a 12-year boy, a very naughty boy, he runs about in Amritsar and meets an 8-year girl. And then he asks every time he meets her, Teri kurmai ho gayi? And one day, she, out of irritation, says yes. And then Lana Singh gets so angry, he runs through the streets of Amritsar and then comes home. And 25 years have passed. Lana Singh has become Havildar and is fighting in the Indian Army on the British side, of course, in the First World War. And he comes home on a leave, and his senior officer, Subedar, he is now a Havildar, his senior officer is also on leave, and he sends a message to Lana Singh to come to his home, and then after they will go to the Lam or battlefield together. He comes to his senior's home, and after formalities, he is asked to he is asked to go inside the house to meet his wife. He says, the Subedar says that she knows him, and he goes inside, and then they he recalls, and then she says to him that she is the girl whom he used to meet in childhood, and she implores him to save the lives of her husband, and his son. And in the battlefield, the battle is raging. The First World War battle, one of the most cruel battles of world history. You just have to read how in trenches, they fought, they lived and fought and did all that. That is another chapter. And Lana Singh gets injured, and even and the son of that lady, he is sick, he is suffering from fever, and he sends that young man back and takes guard, and there he is he's dying, and he remembers words from his childhood, from his youth. Usne kaha tha. That is a wonderful story. And he did in this story, he retains many of the idioms and used in the original story to preserve that effect. Uh, Another story that I have selected to for the purpose of illustrating how a writer has to manage this loss and gain, or has to manage to bridge this gap between two cultures, is a little known story. Vinod Renu has written so many novels and stories. His Mare Gaye Gulfam, Tisri Kasam. There are so many stories that are well known, but this story in particular, and I'm really surprised how the translator chose this story to be included in the book. This is a Pahalwan Ki Dhol. Pahalwan Ki Dhol, the wrestlers. This Pahalwan is a Pahalwan, is a character in a typical Bihar village, He's a wrestler. And he has a spirit, indomitable spirit. And he has a habit of playing on his drum. And the sounds that come out of his drum playing, they have a message, they have a meaning. They can encourage others, they can console others, they can challenge others, like this. I have something to say about the translation of the title of Usne Kaha Tha. I'll talk it later. First, this Pahalwan Ki Dhol. This is the eighth story. Vinod Renu, who brought rural India into mainstream literature. This Lutan Singh, in the village that he lives, it is the village has been attacked by famine, and to make things worse, epidemics have broken out, cholera and malaria, and people are dying. There is a stillness, deathly stillness in the whole of the village, because people are dying one by one. No one is there to help us. Only the drum of this person. He is playing on his drum, and the sounds coming from the drum kind of encouraging the people to fight, to survive. And he has preserved the sounds. And I'll read out the phrases that contain the sounds, and he has preserved the Hindi expressions also. And then he has added that parenthesis, uh, the English meanings of those phrases and words. When the people of his village perished due to hunger and disease, this lion-hearted wrestler, Luton, beats his drum to drive away the fear of death. Luton's drum of life resounds until his last breath, and his spirit remains undefeated even in death. To retain, when Luton Singh, his family died, but he's beating his drum continuously to give a sense of hope to the people. But when people find that no sound is coming from the house of Luton Singh, where he would be beating his drum, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, when the sound didn't come from his village, people go to see and find Luton Singh dead. Wonderful story. Yes, to retain the effect of the original. Dr. Sinha transliterates the sound of the drum and their rhyming Hindi messages while offering their English translation simultaneously. For instance, Chat Girdha, Chat Girdha, Chat Girdha. The messages that come out of these sounds, rhyming with these sounds are Mat Darna, Mat Darna, Mat Darna, fear not. And he adds these English meaning, phrases of English meanings to these sounds. Fear not, fear not, fear not. And then Dha Girgir, Dha Girgir, Dha Girgir, Wah Bahadur, Wah Bahadur, Wah Bahadur. In Hindi, it is Wah Bahadur. And in English, well done, hero, well done, hero, well done, hero. So now that I have told you something about this story, I would ask you to compare this story, and this is especially for the students, to compare it with a great short story in world literature, in English, American, oblique American literature. And I'm sure you will read, you have read it. Can you find can you find a story which you can compare it with? Just think about it. Not now. I'll just give you a clue. The story that I have in mind has a mixed ending. Someone dies to save someone else. And another clue that I give you, in this Hindi story, Halwan Ki Dholak, or Restless Drum, the diseases are malaria and cholera. In the story that I asked you to compare, and the story that I have in mind, the disease is pneumonia. There are many other examples. For example, one case of loss, a complete loss that I found. Godan. Godan is a well-known novel. And there was a translation of Godan, many translations of Godan, but there was one translation of Godan by G.C. Roderman. He changes the title of Godan to The Gift of God. This is a complete loss. The meaning contained in Godan. Godan is not just a gift of God. Godan is a ritual that is performed when a man is dying. A cow is given to a Brahmin for the yes, yes. Oh, Henry, the last sleep. Thank you, Dr. Verma. Thank you. This is one of the stories that I have read and enjoyed time and again. Last year, very good. That this translation of Godan into to the gift of cow. The gift of cow doesn't capture the original meaning, because Godan, as I told you, is donating a cow to a Brahmin when someone is dying, and it is for the atonement of the sins that the man might have committed in the life. So there are many other examples that I'll be talking about in my discussion. The time has is ticking by. So how much time can I take?
So maybe you can just conclude.
I just conclude.
Yeah.
Yes. I have translated. I was thinking of discussing my own books, and I will conclude with a poem. With a poem that I have translated in the book by Tushar. Let's kill that. This book chronicles the events of the last 2 years of Gandhi's life, leading up to his assassination. And the book begins with a poem That poem is from that poem is an extract from Algernon Swinburne's poem Super Flumina Babylonia. I'll just take a few minutes. I'll read out the English poem and then the translation I have made. You can easily say, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I tried my hands. I'll just read out the two poems in English and Hindi and then say goodbye. Such a one never dies. The poem tries to capture the enormity of Gandhi's personality, the immortality that he has achieved in his death. Such a one never dies. He lives, he wakes. Its death is dead. Its death is dead, not he. Unto each man his handiwork, unto each his crown, the just fate gives. Whoso takes the world's life on him and his own lays down, he, dying so, lives. Whoso bears the whole heaviness of the wronged world's weight and puts it by, it is well with him suffering, though he face man's fate. How should he die? Seeing death has no part in him anymore, no power upon his head, he has bought his eternity with a little hour and is not dead. For an hour, if you look at him, he is no more found. For 1 hour's space, then you lift up your eyes to him and behold him crowned, a deathless face, on the mountains of memory, by the world's well springs in all men's eyes, where the light of the life of him is on all past things. Death only dies. I'll just read out the translation of it, just to conclude on a poem on Gandhi. वह कभी नहीं मरता है, वह तो जीता जगता रहता है, मरती है तो मौत, हर को उसका कर्म भोग और हर को उसका ताज, यह न्याय नियति देती है, अपना जीवन जो मानव औरों पर अर्पित करता है, मरकर भी वो जीता है, पीड़ित जन की व्यथा समेटे जो ले लेता अपने मत्थे और रख देता बगल हटाकर, दुख उसका सहगामी बनता, मानव नियति सहता तो क्या, वह कैसे मर सकता है, देख मृत्यु का कोई उस पर वश न चलता, उसने क्रय कर लिया सनातन अपने छूटे जीवन से, हो गया अमर, ओझल रहता दृष्टि पटल से, मिलता हमको नहीं कहीं वह, होता यह बस कुछ लम्हों तक, फिर दृष्टि उठाओ, ऊपर देखो, धारे सिर पर शौर्य मुकुट वह मृत्युंजय, यादों के पर्वत पर देखो, विश्व चेतना की धारा में, जन जन की आंखों में देखो, विद्यमान उसका प्रकाश सब में जो अब तक बीत गया, मृत्यु ही मृत्यु। Thank you all for listening.